Alexander Graves. Alexander Graves had become a name whispered in hushed tones from the cold concrete alleys of New York City to the polished corridors of the Manhattan courthouse. His visage pale and gaunt, with penetrating blue eyes that held a quiet intensity, became an icon of both fear and fascination among the public and the investigators who pursued his every step. It was in New York, among the sprawling urban jungles, concrete canyons and neon nights, that his notorious deeds were both lived and labored over by detectives, psychologists, and community members in an endless quest for answers. On a chilly November evening, Detective Ellen Forrester surveyed the rain-soaked crime scene on 14th Street. The buzz of police radios mixed with the relentless patter of rain, creating a haunting symphony that spoke of unsolved mysteries and hidden dark corners. "Ellen, are you sure we're not dealing with a copycat?" asked her partner, Detective Michael Briggs, his voice heavy with the weight of unspoken worries. Ellen's eyes, though steeled by experience, betrayed her inner conflict as she replied, "I wouldn't underestimate Graves. Every detail he leaves behind seems meticulously planned to taunt us. There's a method in his madness." Alexander's crimes had long since surpassed the ordinary. His calculated approach and unnerving calm had, over time, drawn the attention of forensic psychologists from across the country. Dr. Jonathan Millard, a respected authority on criminal psychologies, had spent months poring over every piece of evidence in the hope of finding a crack in the facade of a man who exhibited both refinement and brutal savagery. "His personality is one of contrasts," Dr. Millard later explained in a seminar at Columbia University. "On one hand, you see a man who is articulate, charming even; on the other, a predator void of true remorse, whose actions stem from a deep, unresolved internal conflict. He is as cold in his calculated planning as he is unpredictable in his moments of impulsivity." Growing up in the outskirts of Chicago, Alexander Graves had endured an upbringing filled with neglect and erratic abuse. Raised by a father who moved from one temporary job to another and a mother whose own struggles with mental illness left her emotionally absent, Alexander found solace in detachment even as his inner world became a crucible of bitterness and distorted ideals. Over the years, this emotional isolation had allowed him to reconstruct his reality, a world where traditional values of empathy and morality were replaced by a cold logic that interpreted life as a series of calculated equations. This early psychological undercurrent provided the basis for his criminal behavior, a relentless pursuit of perfection that he believed justified his horrifying actions. In a seemingly unrelated narrative unfolding in London, journalist Rebecca Turner had embarked on an in-depth investigation into the mystique surrounding Alexander Graves. Known for her incisive interviews and relentless questioning, Rebecca found herself drawn into a labyrinth of conflicting testimonies from families touched by grief and law enforcement officials haunted by the unresolved puzzles of Graves' mind. "There was always this aura, a strange blend of arrogance and vulnerability," Rebecca confided during an exclusive conversation at her London flat overlooking the Thames. "It's as if he was aware of the monster he had become, yet he reveled in the role assigned to him by society." Her interviews with surviving acquaintances and family members painted a picture of a man who was both charismatic and repulsive, someone who could charm a roomful of strangers one moment and then leave them trembling in fear the next. In an expansive, interconnected narrative that spanned decades and continents, Alexander's story was pieced together by fragmented memories and half-remembered moments. At a modest apartment in Los Angeles, Teresa Bloom, whose brother had been one of Graves' victims, recounted how his face seemed to flash before her eyes every time she passed a darkened alley. "I still remember that cold glint in his eyes," Teresa said, her voice trembling as she recounted the harrowing moment of loss. "He wasn't like other killers, it was as though every move, every calculated gesture, was rehearsed, almost as if he was performing on a stage built of shadows and nightmares." The recollections of those who lost loved ones stirred the public's imagination, reinforcing the idea that Alexander Graves was not merely a criminal but a maestro conducting an orchestra of terror. As evidence accumulated and the trial loomed, the courtroom in New York became a battleground of ideologies. The prosecution portrayed Graves as a remorseless killer, systematically dismantling lives with a surgeon's precision. His own testimony, when he finally chose to address the court, was a puzzling blend of mundane observations and introspective insights. In an infamous moment captured on live television, Graves remarked, "I looked into the abyss and found it staring back at me. In chaos, I saw clarity." His cryptic statements left jurors and onlookers alike baffled, a window into a mind that was simultaneously analytical and deeply disturbed. Throughout his trial, multiple perspectives intermingled to form a mosaic of conflicting narratives. The legal team for the defense argued that Graves' actions were the tragic result of unresolved psychological trauma, an inevitable consequence of a childhood spent seeking love in a world that had little to offer. His defense attorney, William Carmichael, drew on studies of attachment disorders and the effects of early emotional deprivation. Alexander Graves is a product of a broken system, Carmichael asserted in a heated exchange with the prosecuting attorney. You cannot judge entire life trajectories from the actions of one man without understanding the punitive cycle of neglect that defined his early years. Yet, for every empathetic perspective thrown in his favor, there was a hardened counter-argument, that reckoning with his monstrous deeds was inevitable, regardless of his troubled past. In a series of interviews conducted by Dr. Millard, a detailed psychological profile emerged, a mosaic of intellectual brilliance intertwined with a profound emotional void. Dr. Millard elaborated on Graves' psychological makeup. He embodies a rare dissociative identity, one where the facade of normalcy masks a mind that is dissecting and reassembling every encounter with a surgical precision. His pleasure in the act of murder was less about sadistic enjoyment and more about the act of proving to himself that he could outsmart the forces that had once forsaken him. Each crime was, in a twisted sense, an experiment, a calculation designed to test the limits of human reactivity and to measure the boundaries of society's empathetic restraints. The trial itself became a public spectacle, with global media networks relaying every dramatic twist. In a dramatic turn, an impassioned testimony from retired Detective Samuel Harper from Chicago provided a direct link to Graves' long-hidden past. "I remember the phone call that came in on that rainy night in 1985, Harper recalled, his voice filled with a haunting blend of nostalgia and regret. There was something in his tone, an eerie calmness that signified we were dealing with a mind so far removed from ordinary expectations, it defied explanation." Harper's words resonated deeply with the public, evoking a sense of both dread and sympathy for a man whose path had been contaminated by a lifetime of isolation and aberration. By the time the dust had settled and the jury delivered its verdict, the narrative of Alexander Graves had taken on multiple layers of meaning. For some, he was the embodiment of a carefully orchestrated reckoning, a symbolic execution of societal failings. For others, he was a cautionary tale of how the seeds of childhood trauma could blossom into unspeakable horror. The detailed courtroom exchanges, steeped in legal jargon and emotional declarations, were a testament to the deep fissures within society's understanding of good and evil. As the story spread, it opened up passionate discussions among legal scholars, seasoned detectives, and even everyday citizens who found themselves grappling with the existential questions raised by Graves' life. Friends and family members of both victims and the convicted murderer took to town halls in New York City, Chicago, and Los Angeles, debating whether society bore a share of responsibility in crafting such a disturbed personality. "We have to ask ourselves," one community leader from Chicago declared during a heated public debate, "is it possible that a mixing of environmental neglect and the absence of meaningful social connections can steer a capable mind down the pathway of such irreversible choices?" The narrative of Alexander Graves did not solely reside within the confines of legal documents and media exposes. It infiltrated the artistic realm as well. In a small but influential art gallery in downtown Manhattan, a controversial exhibit titled "The Anatomy of a Killer" juxtaposed abstract art installations with musical compositions inspired by the chilling cadence of Graves' testimony. The exhibit invited viewers to explore the shades of gray in his personality, a psychological portrait that was as dynamic as it was disturbing. "I think art is the only medium that can capture the silent screams of a tormented soul," remarked the gallery's curator, Lydia Reynolds, during the opening night. Alexander's story is a grim reminder that behind every act of violence, there lies a tapestry of human experiences, tragedies, and broken promises. Across the Atlantic in London, Detective Inspector Charles Whittaker, who had been secretly following the evolution of the international case, shared his reflections during a press conference at Scotland Yard. The case of Alexander Graves transcends borders. His actions cannot be confined to a single country's narrative, they echo in the corridors of every society that has failed in its duty to nurture and protect its vulnerable. We are left with a legacy of questions about the nature of evil, the responsibilities of those who care for children, and the systems that are intended to safeguard our communities. In private conversations among law enforcement circles, whispers revealed a chilling hypothesis. Some officers speculated that Graves might have been influenced by a hidden subculture, one that celebrated the philosophy of nihilism and embraced chaos as a form of art. David Simmons, an undercover operative from Los Angeles, described secret meetings he had once infiltrated. It was a gathering of lost souls who found solace in rejecting every conventional moral compass. Graves seemed to adopt their ideas, twisting them until they became a personal doctrine, a belief that in the void of meaning, there is, ironically, a certain kind of order. His actions, though horrific, were the inevitable product of a mind that had been fertilized by these dangerous ideologies. Dialogue after dialogue, conversation after conversation, the story of Alexander Graves wove itself into the fabric of society's collective memory. Even the families of his incarcerated victims and survivors started to engage in group therapy sessions, led by trauma experts in community centers in New York City and Chicago. During one such session in a community center in downtown Chicago, a soft-spoken woman named Mary Ann expressed, "I see in him the fractures of my own past, the places in my heart that were left unhealed. It's painful, yet in some twisted way, I feel a strange kinship, as if we both were victims of circumstances beyond our control." Her words sparked a fierce debate among the group, with some arguing that such parallels could never justify the unspeakable acts Graves committed, while others empathized with the idea that society's neglect had seeded a tragedy. For his part, Alexander Graves maintained an unnerving silence through much of the trial. When he finally spoke, his voice carried no tremor, no hint of regret. Instead, he seemed to analyze his own words as if they were data points in a vast experiment. In his final statement, delivered in a cold, clinical tone, he said, "Perhaps I was calculating, perhaps I was desperate, in the end, I was merely a mirror held up to a world filled with despair. My actions have forced you to confront the dark recesses within your own souls." These words, though carefully measured, sent shockwaves through every individual present, evoking emotions from revulsion to morbid curiosity. The multifaceted narrative surrounding Alexander Graves continued to evolve even after his conviction. In a retrospective documentary aired on American public television, Dr. Millard dissected his psychological profile in greater detail. "We observe in Graves a confluence of high intellectual ability combined with an emotional dissociation that is rarely seen," he explained during an interview. His capacity for empathy was severely compromised, likely due to repeated childhood trauma, which distorted his ability to perceive others as fully human. Instead, he objectified them, turning his murders into experiments, a methodical exploration of the limits of human behavior under duress. Examining his records in a state-of-the-art forensic lab in Los Angeles, a group of experts discovered that Graves meticulously planned every encounter. His notebooks, hidden in a sealed bank vault, contained hand-drawn flowcharts and complex diagrams that mapped out his criminal enterprises. Each page was a window into his disjointed psyche, revealing both numbers and notes that chronicled a life spent calculating risk and reward. One such entry read, "Emotion is the enemy, vigilance is the only solace." This stark declaration encapsulated the essence of a man who rejected the fundamental nature of human sensitivity in favor of a cold, calculated logic. The narrative further expanded when a series of interviews with former acquaintances of Graves surfaced through independent investigations. One such interview was conducted with Richard Evans, a childhood friend from Chicago who had long been estranged from him. "We all thought he was just a quirky kid with a fascination for science and literature," Richard recalled, his eyes filled with remorse. "But somewhere along the line, he lost his way. I now understand that behind that charming smile was a mind in constant turmoil, a battleground of conflicting ideologies and suppressed emotions that eventually manifested in unthinkable ways. Richard's account, though tinged with nostalgia, offered crucial insight into the slow transformation of a once brilliant young man into a calculated murderer. Within the legal drama that spanned days and nights in the courtroom, the perspectives of victims fused with testimony from those who had once known Graves intimately. Family members recounted holiday gatherings and childhood memories that had been overshadowed by a looming sense of foreboding. In one particularly poignant moment, Angela Carter, whose daughter had been the target of one of Graves' meticulously planned attacks, tearfully stated, "I tried to see the good in him once, thinking perhaps he was a victim of his circumstances. But no amount of understanding can erase the pain he inflicted on my family." Such testimonies laid bare the complex interplay between empathy and accountability, the central moral conundrum that had simultaneously enthralled and repulsed the public. Amidst the ongoing debates in court and on public forums, the media played an influential role in shaping the narrative. Evening news anchors from networks in both the United States and Britain dedicated extensive airtime to discussing the social and psychological implications of Graves' case. Panel discussions featured experts, survivors, and even reformed criminals, each offering their take on whether society's failure to offer nurturing support to its most vulnerable contributed directly to the making of a monster. One notable exchange occurred on a live broadcast from a studio in New York where a host pointedly asked, "If we truly believe that nurture outweighs nature, then where do we draw the line of responsibility when someone like Alexander Graves commits irreparable harm?" His question underscored the deep-rooted conflict between free will and determinism, a discussion that would resonate long after the case was closed. In the midst of these divergent perspectives, the story of Alexander Graves also became a seminal case study in criminal psychology courses across prestigious institutions. Professors dissected the minutiae of his writings and the subtle clues hidden in his court statements. They analyzed how, in his final moments before sentencing, Graves had recited lines that echoed existential philosophies and warnings of modern society's breakdown. One professor remarked in a lecture at Harvard Law School, "Alexander Graves is a paradox, a man who achieved the unthinkable by harnessing the darkest corners of human intellect. His actions compel us to re-examine our own moral constructs and the policies we have long taken for granted." In a prolonged dialogue between survivors and rehabilitated criminals, the spectrum of opinions grew even more complex. At a town hall meeting in downtown Los Angeles, a recovered inmate named Samuel Jacobs shared his thoughts. "We often paint the picture of a killer as someone entirely devoid of emotion," Jacobs said, his tone reflective of years spent in solitary confinement. "But Alexander Graves' case forces us to consider that sometimes, what we label as madness is merely an extreme interpretation of human survival. When our minds are battered by a life of isolation and neglect, we may resort to behaviors that seem monstrous to the rest of society." His remarks sparked immediate counter-arguments from community activists who argued that such interpretations risked excusing his crimes rather than understanding them. As the narrative built toward its climax, the interplay of voices from across continents converged in a sprawling mosaic of human experience, psychology, and moral dissonance. The courtroom drama, the academic discourses, and the raw, unfiltered testimonies from victims and bystanders slowly formed a multi-layered tale that transcended the simplistic labels of hero or villain. In every retelling, Alexander Graves emerged as a symbol, a representation of both the darkness that can lie dormant within an individual and the societal failures that allowed such darkness to fester. The final verdict, delivered with a mix of relief and lingering sorrow by the presiding judge in Manhattan, marked the end of a long and harrowing chapter. The sentence, severe and unequivocal, was a direct response to the extensive evidence presented over months of tireless investigation. Yet, even as the gavel struck down the outcome, collective questions about how such a man had evolved remained unanswered. In private conversations that followed behind closed doors, forensic psychologists, jurists, and investigators continued to debate the roots of Graves' depravity, acknowledging that his detailed psychological profile was a crucial document in the annals of criminology. Unable to escape the swirling vortex of paradoxical interpretations, Alexander Graves himself remained an enigma. During his incarceration in a maximum security prison near Los Angeles, interviews with prison counselors and fellow inmates painted a picture of a man locked in perpetual introspection. He spends hours in his cell, writing in a journal, one prison counselor noted. It's as if he's dissecting every facet of his own soul, trying to understand the intricate interplay between pain and indifference that defined his life. These observations indicated that even in confinement, the inner workings of his mind were active, churning through the residual echoes of a tumultuous past. One particularly revealing interaction occurred during a visit from Dr. Millard, who had been granted special permission to speak with Graves for research purposes. In the dim light of the prison's visiting room, the dialogue took on a clinical detachment that belied the intense personal implications. "Tell me, Alexander," Dr. Millard began, "did you ever feel remorse for the actions you took?" Alexander's gaze was unblinking as he replied, "Remorse is a luxury I cannot afford. In a world without absolutes, every act becomes an experiment, a measure of what can be achieved when one rejects conventional morality." This exchange, a microcosm of the battle between rationality and human emotion, underscored the complexity of a mind that belonged to neither the realm of the typical nor that of the easily understood. Outside the confines of the courtroom and prison walls, the repercussions of Graves' actions rippled outwards into society. Community leaders in New York organized neighborhood watch programs, schools in Chicago introduced specialized courses on emotional intelligence, and mental health initiatives across Los Angeles received an unprecedented level of public attention. These responses, though reactive in nature, highlighted a significant shift in societal awareness regarding the impact of early trauma and the importance of nurturing supportive environments. In a reflective conversation at a small cafe in Greenwich Village, Detective Forrester mused with her longtime colleague, Detective Briggs, over steaming cups of coffee. "Every time we solve another case or bring another criminal to justice, I can't help but wonder if we're addressing the symptoms rather than the cause," she remarked. Michael nodded thoughtfully, adding, "Maybe Graves' case, as horrifying as it was, could be a catalyst for change, a chance for us to look inward and fix the cracks before they allow more monsters to emerge." Their dialogue carried an undercurrent of hope amidst the prevailing despair, a testament to the resilience of those who confront darkness head-on. Still, even as the weight of public and institutional reforms began to take shape, debates raged on in hushed academic circles about the deeper philosophical implications of Graves' existence. Was he an inevitable product of an uncaring society, or a lone aberration that aberrated from the normal progression of human behavior? In a riveting roundtable discussion held in a stately lecture hall at Oxford University, scholars, philosophers, and criminologists explored these themes in depth. "Our understanding of evil," one philosopher argued, "must evolve beyond binary definitions. Graves reminds us that the boundaries between right and wrong are often blurred by the very human imperfections that create us all." The discourse, rich with references to classical literature and modern psychological theory, left no doubt that the case of Alexander Graves would be studied for generations to come. Even as the collective narrative began to settle, personal stories of reconstruction and redemption surfaced from the chaos. In a quiet suburban home in the outskirts of Los Angeles, Angela Carter spent long evenings writing letters, each one a tribute to the memory of her lost daughter, and a fervent plea for societal introspection. "I write to remind myself that life, despite its fractures, still holds the promise of healing," she would later confide to a close friend. Her resilience, born out of unimaginable despair, was emblematic of a broader societal shift toward acknowledging that behind every act of horror lay complex histories and human frailties. The story of Alexander Graves stretched far beyond the confines of a singular man's criminality. It became a mirror reflecting all that is both disturbing and hopeful about human nature. As debates continued in dimly lit corridors of universities, hushed whispers in police precincts, and tearful remembrances in living rooms, the intricate psychological profile of Graves was revisited and reanalyzed time and again. Experts continued to explore the interplay between his intellect and the void that defined his emotional existence, a void that, in their research, underscored how deep-seated trauma could warp even the brightest of minds into conduits of chaos. One of the most compelling aspects of his psychological profile was the notion of a dissociative self, a duality where the calculated, almost scientific aspect of his nature wove itself seamlessly with instinctual, almost animalistic impulses. In a published study later referenced widely in academic journals, Dr. Millard wrote, "Alexander Graves represents an anomaly where cognitive brilliance and emotional bankruptcy coexist. On one level, he calculated his actions with the precision of a mathematician, on another, he embraced a nihilistic ideology that stripped him of the fundamental human connection to empathy and remorse." This dichotomy, both fascinating and tragic in its implications, provided fertile ground for both academic inquiry and moral introspection. Throughout the sprawling narrative, the voices of multiple perspectives, detectives, psychologists, journalists, victims, and even reformed criminals interwove to create a tapestry of human experience that was as unsettling as it was enlightening. Each perspective shed a unique light on the labyrinthine mind of Alexander Graves, offering insights into how a man shaped by neglect and isolation could commit acts that defied reason and challenged every conventional notion of morality. Late one rainy night in Manhattan, as the city hummed with life despite the darkness, Detective Forrester sat alone in her modest apartment overlooking the cityscape. The neon lights flickered on the rain-slick streets below, each pulse a reminder of lives continuously unfolding in a delicate balance of chaos and order. In a moment of rare introspection, she penned down her thoughts in a worn leather journal. "Graves has become a symbol," she wrote. "Not of a singular act of evil, but of a society that's lost its way. In understanding him, I fear that we must confront our own failings, the places where love and compassion have been so recklessly abandoned." Her words resonated deeply, as they captured a universal sentiment of regret and hope, a hope that, perhaps, through understanding, future tragedies could be averted. The unfolding narrative, with its relentless examination of human nature, eventually drew to a close in the annals of history, a fictional tale of monstrous deeds and multifaceted introspection. Lives were forever altered, debates ignited that would span academic disciplines, and a legacy was cemented in the sorrowful memory of both victims and those who sought to understand the mind capable of such darkness. Alexander Graves, as his trial came to an end, was no longer simply a murderer, he had become a cautionary emblem of immeasurable loss, a symbol that demanded society grapple with its own imperfections and neglect. Now, as the last echoes of his footsteps fade from the corridors of justice and memory, the story of Alexander Graves stands as a testimony to a myriad of voices all converging to form one intricate narrative. It is a story that challenges the black and white dichotomy of right and wrong, delving instead into the gray, murky depths of human experience, where every act, every word, is imbued with the complexities of a life shaped by both pain and possibility. This is a fictional tale and not based on actual events. If you enjoyed the story, subscribe to my channel, like, and check the description to find out how you can support my work.